The cool, sterile air of the penthouse boardroom did little to settle the nervous tremor that always preceded a new case. I stood beside the polished obsidian table, my attention fixed on the city lights sprawling far below, a shimmering tapestry of human endeavor that felt utterly disconnected from the grim reality I knew awaited me. The silence, thick with anticipation, was broken only by the hushed tones of a superior officer on the speakerphone, his voice a low thrum against the paneled walls. Local historian Dr. Alistair Finch, apparent home invasion. Patrol officers on scene reported a mess, signs of struggle. "We need you there, Adler, immediately." I nodded, though the superior officer couldn't see it, my gaze still fixed on the distant glow of a helicopter's rotating beacon. My fingers instinctively tightened around the worn leather of my field kit, a familiar comfort. The boardroom, usually a stage for bureaucratic posturing and budget allocations, felt like an antechamber to something far more visceral. I preferred the raw truth of a crime scene to the sanitized falsehoods of corporate power. "I'm on my way," I stated, my voice devoid of the usual pleasantries expected in such a setting. Social niceties were an energy drain, a distraction from the intricate puzzles that occupied my mind. A colleague, the lead detective assigned to the Major Crimes Unit, a man whose weary eyes often mirrored the city's underbelly, offered a curt nod from his seat at the table. He was already rising, his movements economical, a veteran of countless late-night calls. "Transport's waiting downstairs, Reed." The elevator ride down was swift, a blur of polished steel and hushed silence. I used the time to mentally sift through the scarce details. A historian of some renown, specializing in obscure urban legends and forgotten architectural marvels. Not the typical target of a random home invasion, at least not one that usually ended in fatality. My mind, a labyrinth of anatomical knowledge and forensic principles, began to sketch possibilities, discarding probabilities as quickly as they formed. The city outside was a symphony of blaring horns and distant sirens, a stark contrast to the boardroom's quiet detachment. The transport vehicle, an unmarked sedan, cut through the night, its red and blue lights flashing silently, an urgent pulse against the urban sprawl. The detective drove, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, his focus absolute. I sat in the passenger seat, my gaze fixed on the passing streetlights, each one a fleeting moment of clarity in the rush. We arrived at a quiet residential street, lined with imposing Victorian-era homes. Police tape, a bright yellow ribbon of demarcation, fluttered in the faint breeze, cordoning off a grand 3-story house. Uniformed officers stood guard, their faces etched with the somber gravity that always permeated a scene of death. Inside, the house was a tableau of apparent disarray. Overturned antique furniture lay scattered, a valuable Persian rug rucked up against a shattered ceramic lamp. Books, hundreds of them, lay strewn across the polished hardwood floor, their pages splayed open like fallen birds. A palpable tension hung in the air, a metallic tang of something disturbed and violated. "Found him in the study, Adler," the lead detective said, his voice a low rumble as he gestured down a long hallway. "Looks like they ransacked the place. Probably interrupted a robbery." I moved through the chaos, my eyes scanning, processing every detail. My training had taught me to see beyond the obvious, to find the patterns in the disorder. The shattered window, the forced entry, it all screamed home invasion. Yet something felt off. The way a heavy, ornate grandfather clock had been toppled, its pendulum stilled, seemed almost too dramatic. The books, scattered as they were, didn't appear to have been rifled through with any particular purpose. Many were still neatly stacked on shelves, untouched. We entered the study. Dr. Finch lay sprawled on the floor, amidst a further scattering of papers and more books. He was a man of perhaps 60, his face pale and slack. A heavy brass letter opener, glinting dully under the forensic lights, lay discarded a few feet away, its tip stained crimson. "Entry wound suggests the letter opener," a forensic technician kneeling beside the body stated, without looking up. Single stab. Looks like a struggle, then a quick, fatal blow. I knelt, my gloved hands hovering over the scene, careful not to disturb anything. My eyes traced the contours of the victim's body. His left arm was bent at an unnatural angle. His hand splayed open, palm up. The fingers were slightly curled, as if he had been gripping something, or perhaps had just released it. His right arm was tucked beneath him. The scene fit the narrative. An interrupted robbery, a struggle, a desperate defense. But as my gaze lingered on the victim's face, something snagged. His eyes, though vacant, held a peculiar stillness. And then I saw it. Beneath the victim's splayed left hand, almost entirely obscured by the shadow cast by his arm, was a small, delicate silver locket. It was tarnished with age, its surface etched with intricate swirling patterns. What caught my attention wasn't the locket itself, but the fact that it was positioned under his hand, not clutched in it. More profoundly, the locket was pristine. It showed no signs of the violent struggle that had supposedly just taken place. No scuffs, no blood, no dust from the overturned room. It was as if it had been placed there, carefully, after everything else had transpired. My gaze flickered to the letter opener. The forensic technician had noted a single stab wound, but the wound itself, while fatal, seemed almost precise. Not the wild, desperate thrust of an attacker in a frantic struggle. The chaos, the broken window, the scattered belongings. It was all too perfect. A carefully constructed narrative, meticulously designed to tell a specific story. This wasn't a random act of violence. This was a stage. And Dr. Alistair Finch was not merely a victim of circumstance, but a central player in a performance I was only just beginning to comprehend. The killer wasn't just a brute. They were an artist of deception, with an intimate knowledge of how I and others like me would interpret the scene. My challenge had just begun, or perhaps had just released something. My gaze lingered on the slight, almost imperceptible discoloration beneath his fingernails. A faint reddish-brown smudge like dried earth. It was a detail easily missed, overshadowed by the more dramatic injuries. But I knew better than to dismiss anything. Every speck, every fiber told a part of the story. Careful with the hands, I instructed the evidence collector, my voice low. Separate bags for each, and pay close attention to the subungual debris. The collection process was painstaking, a methodical choreography of brushes, tweezers, and sterile swabs. I supervised each step, cataloging every item, every minute detail, as if the scene itself were a complex, fragile organism. The detective, a burly figure with a perpetually furrowed brow, watched me with a mixture of impatience and grudging respect. He wanted answers, and he wanted them fast. I wanted correct answers, no matter how long they took. Back in the lab, the sterile hum of the air filtration system was a familiar comfort. My workstation, a landscape of microscopes, spectrophotometers, and chromatographs, awaited its new puzzle pieces. I began with the victim's clothing. Under the stereo microscope, the fabric of his trousers revealed a tapestry of fibers. Common cotton, synthetic blends, and then something unusual. A few strands, thin as spider silk, with a peculiar opalescent sheen, unlike anything I routinely encountered. I carefully isolated them. Next, the soil samples. The material scraped from the victim's shoes was a rich, dark loam, consistent with the parkland environment where the body was found. But the particles recovered from the folds of his jacket and the cuffs of his trousers, though superficially similar, presented subtle differences. Under higher magnification, I noted tiny, almost crystalline inclusions within the jacket's soil, fragments of quartz and mica that were notably absent from the shoe samples. It wasn't a glaring discrepancy, but it was enough to prickle my professional intuition. The soil on his clothes didn't perfectly match the soil he was supposedly walking in just before his death. It suggested movement, Perhaps even a different primary location. The initial police theory, quickly disseminated, suggested a spontaneous violent encounter in the park, a random act. The weapon, a discarded piece of jagged rebar found nearby, seemed to support this narrative. But the more I delved into the microscopic world of trace evidence, the more that neat narrative began to fray. The rebar itself, when examined, yielded no definitive epidermal cells or fibers from the victim that couldn't be explained by secondary transfer. It felt too clean, too convenient. My attention returned to the subungual debris from the victim's left hand. Under the scanning electron microscope, the reddish-brown smudge resolved into a complex matrix of organic and inorganic material. Plant matter, epithelial cells, and then, nestled amongst them, a cluster of microscopic flecks. They were metallic, irregularly shaped, and possessed a unique, almost ethereal iridescence, shifting from deep violet to dull gold depending on the angle of the light. I had never seen anything quite like it. I spent hours running preliminary analyses, cross-referencing databases, consulting specialized material science literature. The flecks were composed of an alloy I recognized, but rarely encountered outside highly specialized industrial applications. A specific type of refractory metal used in high-temperature furnaces and certain advanced manufacturing processes. It was a contaminant, unequivocally. And it was rare. Far too rare to be an accidental environmental transfer in a city park. My blood ran cold, not from fear, but from a sudden, sharp clarity. This wasn't random. The soil discrepancy, the unusual fibers, the unnervingly clean weapon, and now these iridescent metallic flecks. They weren't inconsistencies. They were deliberate. This contaminant, specifically, felt planted, a subtle signature designed to be overlooked by anyone without my level of microscopic scrutiny. This perpetrator wasn't just violent. They were intelligent. They understood forensic science, understood how evidence was collected, how it was analyzed. They knew how to create misdirection, how to craft a scene that would tell a false story. I was no longer just investigating a crime. I was engaged in a silent, intellectual duel. My focus was broken by the sharp ring of the secure line. It was the detective, his voice tight. "Reed, we need you." Another one. Same MO. "Get to the penthouse boardroom during an emergency call, now. Bring your findings." Another victim. This wasn't an isolated incident. This was a pattern. And the pattern was designed to challenge me directly. I gathered my preliminary reports, the microscopic images of the iridescent flecks magnified on a secure tablet. The game had begun. My preliminary reports on the first case lay splayed across the secure table. Microscopic images of the iridescent flecks still magnified, their alien shimmer mocking me. My gut had twisted into a cold knot the moment the secure line rang, even before the detective's grim voice confirmed my worst fear. This wasn't an isolated incident. This was a pattern. The holographic projection flickered to life, showing the detective's weary face. His eyes, normally sharp and assessing, held a new kind of frustration. "Reed, we have another one. Same MO, different location. The staging, it's almost identical in its meticulousness, but the details are shifted." My fingers instinctively brushed the cool surface of the table. Details shifted. How? My voice was level, betraying none of the furious gears grinding in my mind. This was it. The escalation. The killer wasn't just killing. They were evolving, learning, pushing. This time, the detective continued, a sigh escaping him. The scene suggests a professional hit. Almost too clean, too perfect, like it's screaming organized crime at us. He paused, letting the implication hang. The deceased is a low-level financial analyst. No known connections to any syndicates. Just a quiet life. No enemies beyond a few bad stock picks. I leaned closer to the projection, ignoring the faint hum of the building's ventilation system. And the first victim was staged to look like a spontaneous, rage-fueled act, correct? A random street altercation gone wrong, despite the careful placement of the body, the specific contusions, the scattered personal effects. Exactly. This wasn't just about murder, it was about misdirection. The perpetrator wasn't merely disposing of bodies. They were crafting elaborate forensic puzzles, each designed to send investigators down a different rabbit hole. The first victim's scene, with its simulated chaos, had been a test. This second one, with its fabricated precision, was a declaration. The killer was confident, overtly so, playing a sophisticated game of cat and mouse. He frowned. Not that we've found yet. The crime scene team is still processing, but the initial sweep didn't pick up anything obvious. Why? A signature, I stated, a quiet certainty in my tone. A unique particulate I found on the first victim. It was almost invisible, suggesting the killer knew to minimize its transfer but not eliminate it entirely. A taunt, perhaps. The detective's brow furrowed deeper. A taunt? You think this person is playing games with us? Not with us, I corrected, my eyes narrowing. With me. The first scene was designed to be overlooked by a less attentive eye, a clever misdirection that only an anthropologist might truly question. The detective absorbed it, his expression hardening. So, this killer isn't just smart. They're arrogant, and they know you. They know of me, I clarified. Or, at the very least, they understand the forensic landscape well enough to target a specific kind of expertise. This second scene, designed to frame a different, equally unlikely suspect, confirms it. They're escalating, pushing boundaries, seeing how far they can stretch the narrative before we connect the dots. My mind raced, connecting the invisible threads. Yet the underlying meticulousness, the sheer effort put into creating these divergent narratives, was the unifying factor. It pointed to a singular intelligent mind. A mind that reveled in control, in manipulation. A mind that found satisfaction not just in the act of killing, but in the intellectual challenge of deceiving those who would investigate it. I need every detail from the second scene, I instructed, my voice firm. Every fiber, every trace, every impression. I want full schematics of the apartment, the victim's known routines, their financial records, their social circle. And I want the preliminary autopsy report as soon as it's available. Specifically, look for any anomalies in the wound patterns that defy the professional hit narrative. Any subtle bruising, any microscopic evidence that points away from the obvious. You think they made a mistake? The detective asked, a flicker of hope in his voice. I think they're human, I replied, a grim smile touching my lips. And humans, no matter how brilliant, leave traces, especially when they're enjoying the game this much. The killer was confident, enjoying their intellectual superiority. But that very confidence, that need to prove how clever they were, would be their undoing. They saw this as a game, a challenge, and I was about to show them that I played to win. The game had just begun, and the rules were becoming clearer. This perpetrator wasn't just a killer. They were a storyteller, weaving intricate fictions of death. And I was the only one who could read between their lines. Rain lashed against the panoramic windows, each gust rattling the glass, mirroring the anxiety that gripped the room. The first victim's autopsy photos flickered beside microscopic scans of the second scene's ground samples. Two disparate acts, two victims, yet my gut screamed a connection beyond the clever staging. My fingers traced the edge of a cold, forgotten coffee mug. I'd been here for hours, sifting through data, comparing notes, feeling the subtle pressure of expectation from the others. They needed answers, and I was supposed to provide them. His voice was a low rumble, edged with fatigue. The second, discovered near the docks, drowned, with every indicator pointing to a drunken accident. Too perfect, too clean. That was the problem. The very lack of anomalies was an anomaly in itself. I scrolled through the forensic reports, past fiber analyses, soil compositions, trace evidence. My eyes snagged on a series of electron microscope images from the second scene. A tiny, almost invisible fleck embedded in the victim's clothing. It had been dismissed as environmental debris, too small to identify conclusively without further specialized analysis, and likely irrelevant. But something about its crystalline structure, its slightly iridescent sheen, pricked at my memory. I cross-referenced the image with the first victim's samples. Nothing overtly similar had been flagged. The initial team hadn't seen it, or hadn't known what they were looking for. They were looking for blood, for skin, for fibers that belonged to the killer. I was looking for the killer's signature, not just their presence. My internal clock was ticking. I pulled up the raw data from the first scene again, focusing on the clothing, the ground around the body. I zoomed in, pixel by painstaking pixel, pushing the resolution limits. It took me another 20 minutes, my eyes burning, before I found it. A single minuscule particle, nearly identical in morphology to the one from the second scene, lodged deep within the weave of the first victim's jacket. It was barely there, a ghost of a speck, but it was there. This wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't environmental. This was a specific non-biological contaminant. I need a complete spectral analysis on these, I said, my voice low, cutting through the boardroom's quiet hum. I pointed to the two tiny magnified images on the screen. Immediately, tell the lab it's priority 1, top clearance. I need to know its exact composition. The forensic technician, a young woman who had been quietly observing, nodded and began relaying my instructions. The senior detective raised an eyebrow, a question in his tired eyes. "You found something?" he asked, his voice now holding a sliver of hope. "Perhaps," I replied, my mind already racing ahead. What kind of material was this? It wasn't metal, not plastic, not organic. Its structure was too uniform, too refined. It looked almost like a specialized abrasive or perhaps a fine polishing compound. Something used in a very particular industrial or scientific process. The wait felt endless. Minutes stretched into an eternity. I leaned back in my chair, picturing the two scenes, the meticulous staging, the deliberate misdirection. And now, this tiny, almost imperceptible link. You think you're clever? Try finding this. Then, the ping. The lab results were in. The forensic technician quickly pulled up the report. My eyes scanned the data, searching for the key. Silicon carbide microabrasive. The words hit me like a physical blow. Silicon carbide. Not just any silicon carbide, but a specific grade, a microabrasive used in high-precision grinding, lapping, and polishing operations. Operations found in specialized manufacturing, optics, and forensic laboratories. For preparing samples, for polishing bone cross-sections, for fine-tuning instruments. My breath hitched. My internal thoughts screamed. This wasn't some random industrial contaminant. This wasn't something you'd pick up walking down the street. This was a controlled substance found in specific clean environments. Environments like the ones I worked in. Environments like the ones my colleagues worked in. Environments like the ones my students had access to. The boardroom suddenly felt suffocating. The rain outside seemed to intensify its assault. My hands clenched beneath the table, knuckles white. The killer wasn't just intelligent. They were informed. They had access. They understood the nuances of trace evidence, knew how easily something this minute could be overlooked. They were challenging me, not just with their methods, but with their proximity. This changed everything. The game wasn't just intellectual anymore. It was personal. The perpetrator wasn't some anonymous phantom. They were someone who moved in my world, breathed my air, perhaps even shared my professional language. The idea sent a tremor through me, a sickening lurch in my gut. Someone I knew, or had known, was capable of this. "What is it, Reed?" The senior investigator's voice was sharp, cutting through my thoughts. I looked up, meeting his gaze. My face felt like stone, my voice tight. It's a microabrasive, a very specific grade. I paused, letting the implications sink in for him, though he couldn't possibly grasp the full weight of it yet. It's used in highly specialized environments: clean rooms, precision manufacturing, and forensic labs. A heavy silence descended, colder than before. The senior investigator's eyes narrowed, processing the information. He understood the forensic labs part. He understood the implications of specialized environments. Every colleague, every former student, every peer who had ever shared a bench or debated a finding. One of them, perhaps, was looking at me right now, through the lens of their twisted game. The confidence of the killer, their intellectual superiority, now seemed less a boast and more a direct challenge to me, to my world. I had underestimated their audacity, but I wouldn't do it again. The rules hadn't just changed. They had become terrifyingly intimate. Every colleague, every specialist I'd ever worked alongside, every. Around the table sat the senior investigator, his face a mask of grim satisfaction, and several other detectives, their expressions a mix of relief and certainty. "We've got him, Adler," the senior investigator declared, his voice cutting through the hum of the air conditioning. He gestured to a large screen displaying a grainy surveillance photo. The subject's financial records show a direct transaction to the victim's account just 3 days before the incident. And our sweep of the victim's apartment turned up this. He clicked a remote, and the screen flashed to a close-up of a small, distinctive silver locket resting on a velvet cloth. It was tucked under a loose floorboard. Matches the description of a family heirloom reported stolen from our suspect's residence last month. A cold dread coiled in my stomach. The suspect, a quiet, unassuming archivist I'd met briefly at a specialized historical society symposium, was utterly incapable of such calculated brutality. This was precisely the kind of precise, misleading evidence the killer would plant. The locket, the financial transaction, designed to appear damning, yet too neat, too perfectly aligned with a motive. "And the alibi?" I asked, my voice betraying none of the disbelief churning inside me. A detective at the end of the table scoffed. "Flimsy. Claims he was at a secluded cabin, no witnesses. Said he was researching some obscure historical text." He rolled his eyes. "The archivist is known for his reclusive research trips. This is too convenient. It's a red herring, meticulously placed." A ripple of discontent went through the room. The senior investigator's brow furrowed. "Adler, we appreciate your thoroughness, but we have motive, opportunity, and now physical evidence directly linking him to the victim and the scene." He leaned forward, his voice taking on a sharper edge. "Are you suggesting we ignore solid police work for another one of your academic theories?" My jaw tightened. "I'm suggesting we look closer at how that evidence appeared. The locket, for instance." I examined the victim's apartment. The killer moved with surgical precision. They left behind specific, subtle traces, minute fiber transfers from specialized industrial-grade cleaning cloths, not household ones. Yet, they conveniently missed a loose floorboard with a valuable item underneath. That doesn't align with the meticulous nature of the other scenes. I pushed my notes across the table, my voice gaining a steady, insistent rhythm. Consider the ligature marks on the first victim. They were designed to mimic a frenzied amateur attack. But the microscopic examination of the abrasive material embedded in the skin revealed uniform particles, consistent with a very specific type of synthetic rope, applied with controlled, consistent pressure. Not a random, panicked act. "So what, the killer's a rope expert now? Or a cleaner?" He chuckled, a sound devoid of humor. "We've got a suspect who had a clear dispute with the victim, confirmed by multiple sources, and your takeaway is that the rope was too perfect?" "My takeaway," I said, meeting his gaze squarely, "is that the killer understands forensic countermeasures. They know what we look for. They know how to create noise, how to manipulate the narrative of a crime scene. The financial transaction? Easy to fabricate, especially for someone with access to specific digital tools. The locket? Planted. It's a classic misdirection, a perfectly constructed alibi for the real perpetrator while framing an innocent party. I pointed to the surveillance photo of the archivist. Look at the victim's apartment again. The placement of the body. The specific, almost artistic arrangement of certain items. The killer isn't just brutal. They're a storyteller, and they're telling you a lie. This archivist, with his quiet life and obsession with ancient texts, does not fit the profile of someone capable of such sophisticated deception. The senior investigator rubbed his temples, a vein throbbing faintly. Adler, we appreciate your perspective, but we have a lead, a strong one. We can't just dismiss it because it doesn't fit your theoretical framework. Dismissing it means falling directly into the killer's trap. I retorted, my voice unwavering. This isn't about theory. It's about observation, about meticulous detail. The killer wants us to chase this ghost, to waste resources, to lose precious time. Every fiber, every dust particle, every microscopic abrasion tells a story. And the story they're telling here is one of deliberate, intelligent manipulation. If we pursue this archivist, we validate the killer's cunning. We tell them their misdirection works. The silence that followed was thick, heavy with unspoken frustration and doubt. The detectives exchanged uneasy glances. They wanted a solution, a name, a clean arrest. I was offering them complexity, a challenge to their fundamental assumptions. We will proceed with the arrest, the senior investigator finally stated, his voice flat, resolute. But I knew then that I stood alone, at least for now. They were blind to the artistry of the deception, seduced by the obvious. But I wouldn't be. I gathered my notes, the weight of the innocent archivist's fate pressing on me. The real killer was out there, watching, perhaps even smiling. Fluorescent lights glared off the polished mahogany, reflecting the strained faces of the senior investigator and his team. They had proceeded with the arrest. I knew it was a mistake. My gut, that quiet, insistent voice that had guided me through countless bone fragments and buried secrets, screamed that we were chasing a phantom while the true predator sharpened its claws. We need your final assessment. The evidence against the apprehended individual is compelling, as you initially outlined. Motive, opportunity, means. Everything aligns with the profile you provided, the one pointing to an insider. I met his gaze, my own conviction hardening. Compelling, yes, but also too compelling, too perfect. The words felt inadequate, a whisper against the gale force of their desire for a quick resolution. The staging was meticulous, designed to lead us down that specific path. Every piece of evidence was carefully placed, every red herring precisely deployed. A younger detective seated opposite me shifted. So you're saying it's still a frame-up? Even with all this new corroboration? I'm saying the corroboration itself is part of the frame-up, I clarified, my voice steady despite the tremor of frustration deep inside me. Think about it. The killer knows our methods, knows what we look for. They don't just commit a crime, they craft a narrative. And the narrative they're crafting isn't about the current victim. It's about something else entirely. The senior investigator exhaled slowly, a sound like air escaping a punctured tire. Then what is it about, Reed? We've been through their backgrounds, their associates, their financial records. We've chased every lead. What are we missing? My gaze swept over the digital display projected onto the far wall. A collage of the victims' faces, their brief bios beneath them. The city planner, the legal aide, the retired journalist. Disparate lives, seemingly unconnected beyond their violent ends. But I had spent the last 24 hours, fueled by caffeine and a gnawing sense of urgency, dissecting their histories with a different lens. But the killer's knowledge, their precision, it pointed to a deeper, more obscure connection. Something that wouldn't surface in a standard background check. I tapped a finger on the polished surface of the table, though no one else seemed to notice the gesture. I cross-referenced their public records, not for current entanglements, but for any overlap in their lives, however minor, years ago. Something that might have faded from public memory, but not from someone seeking retribution. Silence hung heavy. They were waiting. I could feel their skepticism, their reluctance to abandon a seemingly closed case. The city planner, the legal aide, the retired journalist, I recited, pointing to their images on the screen. Each, in their own way, was indirectly involved in the Sterling case. A low murmur rippled through the room. The Sterling case. The name resonated with a faint, almost forgotten echo. A high-profile disappearance, a botched investigation, accusations of cover-ups, and ultimately no arrests. It had been a stain on the city's justice system, a wound that had never truly healed. The city planner, I continued, was a junior analyst on the zoning committee that approved the controversial redevelopment project near the victim's last known location. The legal aide was a paralegal for the defense team of a key person of interest whose alibi was widely disputed. And the retired journalist? He broke the story, sensationalizing details and arguably influencing public perception against the original investigators. I paused, letting the implications sink in. The faces around the table shifted from impatience to a dawning, uncomfortable comprehension. The killer isn't just framing people for current crimes, I theorized, my mind racing, connecting the disparate threads into a coherent tapestry. They're meticulously correcting past injustices. They're not just exacting revenge. They're rewriting history, using forensic science as their weapon of retribution. Each staged scene isn't just a misdirection. It's a deliberate forensic counter-narrative to the failures of the Sterling case. They're exposing the flaws, the biases, the shortcuts that allowed a perpetrator to walk free or a truth to remain buried. The senior investigator slowly pushed back his chair, the squeak of the legs grating in the sudden quiet. You're saying the person we have in custody. It wasn't just about a mistake. It was about the profound implications of what I had just laid bare. We weren't just hunting a killer. We were caught in a decades-old vendetta, orchestrated by a mind that saw forensic science not as a path to truth, but as a scalpel for vengeance. This wasn't just a challenge to my expertise. It was a personal confrontation with a killer who understood the very language I spoke and was using it to mock us all. My words, delivered with a precision honed over years of dissecting the macabre, still hung like a shroud. The lead detective, a man whose face seemed permanently etched with the weight of his profession, leaned forward. A cold case. An alleged series of accidental deaths at an experimental research facility. They were ruled as such, but the pattern, the signatures, I see them now through a different lens. A colleague, whose expertise lay in digital forensics, tapped a stylus against a tablet screen. The records for that place are sparse. Decommissioned, then demolished, officially. But there are whispers of an annex, an off-site facility that wasn't fully documented. Exactly, I affirmed, a jolt of recognition hitting me. That annex. It was rumored to be where some of the more unorthodox experiments took place. A place where the lines between accidental and deliberate might have blurred beyond recognition. If our perpetrator is drawing from that history, that's where we might find the source material for their current designs. The room was silent for a beat, the implications settling. This wasn't just about catching a killer. It was about revisiting a historical injustice. A past failure of the system, perhaps even my system. The vendetta wasn't just against the field. It was against those of us who upheld its principles. My determination solidified. I need to see it. This annex, if it still exists. The lead detective hesitated. It's likely derelict, Adler. Dangerous. All the better, I replied, my voice sharper than I intended. A ghost hunting a ghost. It took a few hours to pinpoint the exact location. Not on any current map, but cross-referencing old municipal planning documents with satellite imagery revealed a crumbling structure tucked away beyond an overgrown service road, miles outside the city limits. An abandoned forensic lab, a relic of forgotten science. The building emerged from a thicket of tangled brush like a forgotten tombstone. A single-story, windowless concrete block, its surface streaked with grime and graffiti. A faded sign, barely legible, read, "Experimental Research Annex, authorized personnel only." The irony was not lost on me. The air was cool, carrying the scent of damp earth and decay. I pulled a sturdy flashlight from my bag, the beam cutting a crisp circle in the gloom. The front door, a heavy steel slab, hung ajar, one hinge rusted through, the other groaning under the weight. My boots crunched on shattered glass and dried plaster. The interior was a labyrinth of narrow corridors, each door either missing or hanging precariously. This wasn't a place for the faint of heart or for the unprepared. My forensic mind, however, saw not just ruin, but a story. The story of what had been and what could be again. I moved slowly, methodically, my flashlight beam dancing over overturned tables, rusted analytical equipment, and shelves stripped bare. This wasn't just abandoned. It felt picked over, perhaps even cleared out in a hurry. The silence was unnerving, too profound for a truly derelict building. There should be creaks, groans, the scuttling of vermin. But there was nothing, only the echo of my own footsteps. Then I saw it. Not water, but a residue. A faint oily film. My beam caught a glint of metal in the corner. A single, meticulously placed and highly reflective prism, no larger than my thumb. It was angled to catch any light from the doorway, a subtle beacon. A prickle of unease ran down my spine. Too neat, too deliberate. This wasn't just a forgotten corner. It was a stage. My gaze shot up. The ceiling directly above the prism, a patchwork of corroded metal panels, looked unstable. One particular panel, larger than the rest, seemed to sag more than the others, held by a single thin wire barely visible in the gloom. The Ghost Lab cases. One of the deaths involved a structural collapse, a heavy ventilation unit falling onto an unsuspecting researcher. Ruled an accident, a failure of old infrastructure. But what if it wasn't? What if it was designed? I took another step, my foot landing on a loose floorboard. A soft click echoed from somewhere above. My head snapped up. The wire holding the sagging panel twanged, tightening fractionally. This wasn't just a coincidence. The prism, the residue, the unstable panel, the floorboard. It was all a carefully orchestrated sequence. A trap, designed for me. The killer knew I would come here. Knew my methods, my obsession with details. Knew how to replicate its deadly accidents. The floorboard groaned again under my weight. I felt a vibration, subtle at first, then growing, running up through the soles of my boots. The ceiling panel above me shuddered. The single wire began to fray. My training kicked in, overriding the surge of adrenaline. Move. Not back, that would trigger it further. To the side. I launched myself forward, a desperate lunge, scrambling away from the target zone. My shoulder scraped against a rusty pipe as I dove, rolling into the relative safety of an adjacent alcove. A deafening roar erupted behind me. Metal shrieked, concrete cracked, and a cloud of pulverized dust exploded into the chamber. The heavy panel, along with a cascade of rusted pipes and debris, slammed into the floor where I had been standing moments before, pulverizing the very spot. The impact shook the entire building, sending a fresh wave of dust and debris raining down. I lay there, gasping, the acrid taste of dust filling my mouth, the ringing in my ears almost unbearable. This wasn't a warning shot. This was an execution attempt. The killer wasn't just challenging my intellect. They were trying to eliminate me. It was personal, and I was now irrevocably caught in its deadly snare. The floorboard groaned again under my weight, a deep, unsettling creak that resonated through the hollow space beneath. The ceiling panel above me shuddered, shedding a fine dust that settled on my coat. The single wire, taut and shimmering in the low light, began to fray, its copper strands snapping with tiny, almost inaudible reports. Move. Not back. That would trigger the pressure plate I'd just stepped off. Not forward. The entire section was compromised. My eyes darted to the periphery, scanning for any solid purchase, any unexpected anchor point. To my left, a narrow steel support beam ran vertically, barely wide enough for a handhold. I shifted my weight with agonizing slowness, muscles screaming in protest. The floorboard under my left foot dipped another fraction of an inch. It wasn't gunpowder, not exactly, more complex. With a grunt, I launched myself sideways, arms outstretched, fingers scrabbling for the cold, unforgiving steel. My body slammed against the beam, knuckles scraping, a sharp jolt running through my shoulder. A rush of displaced air, then the clang of something heavy impacting concrete far beneath. It wasn't just a trap. It was a signature. My boots found purchase on a lower crossbeam. I pulled myself up, heart thrumming against my ribs, but my focus sharpened. This wasn't random. I couldn't leave it. Not yet. Carefully, I retrieved a small collection kit from my satchel. Using tweezers, I extracted a few of the frayed copper strands from the remaining wire, then scraped a minute sample of the residue clinging to the splintered edge of the collapsed floorboard. The substance was a pale, almost translucent powder, clinging stubbornly to the wood fibers. I sealed the samples in separate vials, the memory of that unique scent already cataloged in my mind. This was a message, and I intended to read it. My comms device buzzed, startling me. "Reed, where are you?" "Now." It was the lead detective, his voice tight with urgency. Another development. I secured my samples, made a mental note of the trap's precise mechanics for later analysis, and began the climb out of the compromised section. The air conditioning hummed, a clinical drone that did little to cut the tension radiating from the half-dozen people clustered around the immense table. The lead detective stood at the head, his face grim. A security specialist gestured emphatically at a projected schematic. "Reed, glad you could join us," the detective said, his tone clipped. "We've had another incident, identical staging. This time, however, a secure data server was breached. We're looking at a systemic attack." I nodded, my mind still processing the scent from the trap. "I have something that might be relevant." I placed my small kit on the corner of the polished table, drawing curious glances. Evidence from the last site. A residue, specific to the trap mechanism. The security specialist scoffed. "What could a powder tell us about a digital breach?" "Everything, if it's the right powder," I retorted, already setting up my portable spectroscopic analyzer. The device, usually confined to the lab, looked almost alien on the boardroom's pristine surface. I carefully opened the vial containing the pale residue from the floorboard. Under the focused beam, the powder glowed, revealing an intricate crystalline structure. I loaded the spectral data into the analyzer's memory, running it against known compounds. The display flickered, then resolved into a complex molecular diagram. I zoomed in, tracing the bonds, the unique arrangement of atoms. It wasn't a standard explosive residue, nor a common industrial accelerant. This was something far more specialized. The spectral lines, the specific isotopes, the unusual bonding. It was a signature I knew. A signature I had painstakingly researched years ago. My mind raced, pulling from deep, dusty corners of my memory. A joint research project, a grant proposal, long nights in a shared lab, fueled by stale coffee and a shared obsession with trace forensics. The compound, a synthetic polymer designed for ultra-low friction applications, with a unique luminescent property under specific UV frequencies. It was rare, incredibly difficult to synthesize, and had only ever been successfully produced in a handful of labs worldwide. Ours was one of them. and the lead researcher on that specific subproject, the one who had championed its potential for covert applications, the one who had practically lived in the synthesis chamber for months, perfecting its stability and signature? Alistair Finch. Alistair, my former colleague. Brilliant, yes, but increasingly reclusive, resentful of what he perceived as a lack of recognition. We had drifted apart after the project's funding dried up, a quiet, unspoken chasm growing between us. But this was a chasm of betrayal, a canyon carved by malice. My hand trembled as I keyed in the name into the analyzer's database, cross-referencing the compound with our old project files. The match was instantaneous, irrefutable. Project Chimera, subcomponent 7G. Primary researcher, Dr. A. He wasn't just a brilliant mind. He was a brilliant mind who knew my mind. He was challenging me, taunting me, using our shared past as his twisted canvas. The room, moments ago filled with the low hum of the analyzer and hushed conversations, seemed to press in on me, suffocating. My adversary wasn't some unknown phantom. He was a ghost from my own past, armed with my own insights. The personal stakes, already high, had just become devastatingly so. The killer wasn't just intelligent. He was intimate, and he was very, very close. The emergency call blared, pulling me from the cold, hard facts on the screen. He wasn't just a brilliant mind. He was a brilliant mind who knew my mind intimately. Harsh LED lights glared off the polished mahogany table. The air hummed with a different kind of tension than usual, an invisible static electricity that prickled my skin. I could feel the weight of every gaze as I entered, my determination a cold knot in my gut. Adler, glad you could join us. The chief investigator's voice was clipped, impeccably dressed, a picture of calm professionalism. His gaze met mine, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. Triumph? Challenge? He offered a subtle, almost imperceptible smirk. My jaw tightened. I felt the slow burn of betrayal, a personal sting far sharper than any professional disappointment. He had played me, used me, and now he was here, watching the final act. This came in barely an hour ago, the chief investigator continued, gesturing towards a large monitor displaying crime scene photos. My breath hitched. It was an abandoned factory, a familiar setting for our line of work. But this wasn't just a scene. It was the scene. The final elaborate trap. The images flashed. A body, unmistakably the last missing colleague, sprawled amidst industrial debris. But it was the details that screamed. A single, distinctively patterned glove, like the ones I favored, lay discarded near the victim's hand. A half-empty coffee cup, the brand I always drank, sat on an overturned crate. And then, the close-up. A small, almost imperceptible smear of blood on a discarded forensic tool. A bone saw, one of my specialized implements, meticulously cleaned, yet leaving a trace. My own tools, my own habits, my own methods. We found this at the scene, a forensic technician added, sliding an evidence bag across the table. Inside, a small, intricate carving of an owl, a known personal affectation of mine, lay nestled. It was too much. My gaze never left Finch, an elaborate, meticulously planned frame. The chief investigator scoffed. A setup, Adler? With your DNA on the coffee cup, your unique glove print, your personal carving, and the victim's blood on your specialized saw? It's damning. No, I countered, stepping closer to the screen, my mind racing, dissecting every detail. This was it. The duel. It's too damning. Finch, you've overplayed your hand. A ripple of murmurs spread through the boardroom. Finch merely steepled his fingers, a faint smile playing on his lips. My hand, Reed? I'm merely observing the evidence like everyone else. You've been observing for months, I shot back, my voice gaining strength. Observing my methods, my preferences, my blind spots. You knew exactly what to plant, what to mimic. I pointed at the screen. Look at the blood spatter on the wall behind the victim. It's a textbook arterial spray, precisely what you'd expect from a deep cut. But it's too perfect. The pattern dispersion is uniform, almost artistic. A real arterial spray, especially in a struggle, would be far more erratic, influenced by movement, by the victim's thrashing. I moved to another image, zooming in on the discarded glove. This glove. My brand, yes. But look at the subtle wear pattern on the thumb and forefinger. I'm right-handed, Finch. The wear on this glove is indicative of a left-handed user. A subtle detail, easily overlooked but crucial. The chief investigator leaned forward, his brow furrowed. Left-handed? Precisely, I affirmed, my eyes locking with Finch's. His smile faltered, just a fraction. And the coffee cup. My brand, my preferred blend. A trick you used on the second victim scene, remember? The fresh cigarette butt that had been extinguished hours prior. Finch's composure began to crack. His jaw tightened, his gaze hardening. You're grasping at straws, Adler. You're desperate. Desperate to expose a betrayer, I retorted. The owl carving. My carving. But the wood grain on the back, near the base, shows a faint, almost imperceptible scratch. A signature mark you inadvertently left on the third victim's scene, on a piece of discarded lumber when you were staging the accidental collapse. You transferred it, believing it would further implicate me, but it links back to your work, Finch. Your unique, subtle error in judgment. The boardroom was silent, every eye now fixed on Finch. The chief investigator looked from me to him, a dawning horror on his face. And finally, I pressed, stepping away from the screen, my voice low and dangerous. The bone saw, my specialized tool. You wiped it clean, but not perfectly. A microscopic fiber trapped in the serrations. Not from the victim, but from the fabric of your lab coat, Finch. His eyes blazed with a mix of fury and cornered animal desperation. This is absurd. You're fabricating, twisting things. Am I? I challenged, my voice unwavering. Or am I simply reading the evidence, Finch? The evidence you so carefully laid out. You thought you were smarter, that your knowledge of my methods would be your shield. But it became your downfall. You couldn't resist leaving your own subtle signature, the very thing you accused me of. He lunged, a sudden explosive burst of violence, overturning the table as he went. Pens scattered, papers flew. The chief investigator shouted, but Finch was already across the room, heading for the exit. He was fast, but I anticipated his trajectory. I sidestepped his charge, catching his arm, twisting it. He grunted, struggling, his forensic precision replaced by brute, unrefined force. You won't get away with this, I snarled, holding him firm. The weight of every victim, every deception fueling my grip. Not after all of this. The chief investigator and another colleague were on him then, pulling his back, restraining his flailing limbs. Finch thrashed, his mask completely gone, replaced by a snarling, desperate rage. He had lost the duel. The chief investigator's grip on my arm was firm, a tether preventing me from lunging forward, though the impulse had already died. Finch thrashed, a guttural sound torn from his throat, a primal rage replacing the meticulous facade he'd worn for so long. He had lost the duel, yes, but the fire in his gaze suggested a war far from over, even as two more colleagues moved in, efficiently securing his limbs. The warehouse, moments before a stage for intellectual combat, now echoed with the sounds of cuffs clicking shut and Finch's ragged breathing. My own breath came in shallow bursts, my chest tight. The adrenaline, which had coursed through me like an electric current, began to recede, leaving a hollow ache in its wake. I watched as they hauled him away, his form struggling against their hold, until he was just a receding shadow swallowed by the chaos of flashing lights and urgent voices outside. I stood amidst the forensic team, the air thick with the metallic tang of blood and the acrid scent of fear. The chief investigator clapped a heavy hand on my shoulder, a gesture of both camaraderie and a reminder of the grim reality. "Reed," he said, his voice low. "It's done." My mind, however, kept replaying Finch's last look, the sheer, unadulterated venom. It was a look that would likely haunt my waking thoughts for some time. I felt a profound weariness settle into my bones, a mental exhaustion that eclipsed any physical fatigue. The opulent setting felt jarringly out of place after the grime and tension of the warehouse. Polished mahogany gleamed under recessed lighting, and the scent of expensive coffee mingled with the faint, persistent odor of antiseptic that seemed to cling to my clothes. Several high-ranking officials and the chief investigator were already seated around the massive table, their faces grim, their posture rigid. I took an empty chair, feeling the weight of their collective gaze. "Reed Adler," the chief investigator began, his voice cutting through the hushed tension. "Your insights were crucial. Without your understanding of his methods, his particular brand of intellectual arrogance, we might still be chasing ghosts." A nod from one of the officials confirmed the sentiment. It was an acknowledgement, not praise, but it felt like a heavy burden. Then came the reveal. The chief investigator projected a series of images onto the large screen at the head of the table. Diagrams, timelines, meticulously cataloged evidence. Finch's motivation, he explained, was a twisted form of intellectual superiority. He saw himself as the ultimate arbiter of forensic truth, believing the system was complacent, predictable. His victims were not random. They were chosen for specific reasons. Their lifestyles, their connections, their lack of a clear, immediate motive for conventional violence. Each staging was a puzzle meant to confound, a challenge thrown directly at the forensic community, a demonstration of his mastery over death and its interpretation. He had used his intimate knowledge of taphonomy, pathology, and trace evidence to weave narratives of misdirection so intricate they bordered on artistry. He hadn't just killed. He had sculpted crime scenes, each one a masterpiece of deception. He had meticulously studied our reactions, our processes, almost as if he were running an elaborate, deadly experiment. He considered it a game, the chief investigator concluded, his voice laced with disgust. A duel of wits, and he chose you, Adler, as his primary opponent. The words hung in the air, a heavy shroud. Finch's hatred, his final glare, suddenly made terrifying sense. I had inadvertently become the instrument of his downfall, the variable he hadn't accounted for, the one who could see past his elaborate illusions. The knowledge was a bitter pill, but Finch had shown me the terrifying inverse. How that same knowledge, wielded by a brilliant but broken mind, could be twisted into a weapon of profound deception and destruction. The room began to empty, the officials dispersing, their faces still etched with the gravity of the revelations. I remained in my seat, the city lights outside blurring into streaks of color. The police had acknowledged my role, yes, but the experience left me with a profound unease. If the very tools we used to seek truth could be so expertly subverted, so meticulously inverted, what did that say about the fragility of justice? The monster had been caged, but the questions he had unleashed still roamed free, their answers far more elusive than any bone fragment or trace of blood. The words had hung in the air, a heavy shroud. Finch's hatred, his final glare, suddenly made terrifying sense. The knowledge was a bitter pill. I had spent weeks dissecting his intricate deceptions, meticulously peeling back layers of manufactured evidence, only to find the architect of those lies was someone who understood the very language I spoke. The weight of that understanding pressed down on me, heavier than any physical burden. Hours later, the adrenaline had mostly drained, leaving behind a profound exhaustion that settled deep in my bones. I sat in a high-backed leather chair, the kind designed for comfort during protracted negotiations, not the processing of a recent trauma. Outside the panoramic windows, the city lights glittered, oblivious to the quiet drama that had unfolded within its concrete arteries. The lead detective, looking as worn as I felt, leaned against the polished mahogany table, his tie loosened, his usually stern face etched with fatigue. A colleague from the field office who had assisted with the evidence analysis sat opposite me, picking at a loose thread on his cuff. The official report lay open between us, its pages stark white against the dark wood. "It's over, Adler," the detective stated, his voice raspy. He didn't offer details, nor did I ask for them. The implication was clear. Finch was no longer a threat. The elaborate dance of deception and pursuit had concluded. It was the event I had been anticipating, yet it offered no real sense of triumph, only a quiet, weary finality. We're working on identifying the others from Finch's earlier, unlinked activities. It'll take time, but the misdirection has been stripped away. My gaze drifted to the city below, a sprawling tapestry of light and shadow. Finch had used the very fabric of forensic science, the tools meant to reveal truth, to weave an intricate web of lies. He hadn't just committed murder, he had weaponized knowledge. He knew how I thought, how we thought, and he had exploited that shared understanding. This was the reveal. It wasn't just about Finch's capture, it was about the profound, unsettling implication of his methods. Forensic science, in the wrong hands, was not just a shield against injustice, but a potential sword of unimaginable precision. Finch hadn't just learned the rules, he'd mastered them to break them, to warp perception, to make the truth utterly unrecognizable. He had challenged the very foundation of my profession, proving that even the most objective data could be manipulated if one possessed enough understanding and malevolence. My initial fascination with the puzzle had slowly transformed into a grim realization of the stakes. Each staged scene, each meticulously placed false clue, had been a taunt, a test of my ability to see beyond the constructed reality. Finch had pushed me, forced me to question every assumption, every ingrained methodology. He had exposed a vulnerability not in the science itself, but in its human interpreters. He understood the gaps, I murmured, more to myself than to the room. The places where inference replaces direct observation. He exploited those beautifully. The colleague shifted, clearing his throat. "It was brilliant, Adler. Terrifyingly so. Without your unique perspective, we might never have pieced it together." "My perspective," I echoed, a wry twist to my lips. My social awkwardness, my tendency to see patterns where others saw chaos, had been both my lifelong burden and, in this instance, my salvation. Finch had operated on a plane of abstraction that few could follow, a world built on the nuances of forensic detail. He had found his mirror in me, and that realization was still unsettling. The exhaustion was still there, a dull ache, but beneath it, something else stirred. A quiet resolve. The immediate threat was gone, the immediate puzzle solved, but the experience had fundamentally changed me. It wasn't just about catching a killer anymore. The world was not as straightforward as the clean lines of a laboratory experiment. It was a complex, layered tapestry of intent and consequence, where the line between fact and fabrication could be meticulously blurred. My dedication to uncovering the truth, once a purely intellectual pursuit, now carried a heavier, more personal weight. I pushed myself up from the chair, the leather creaking softly. The city outside continued its indifferent hum. The case was closed, but the lessons it imparted would resonate for a long time. My work, I knew, would never be just about bones and dust again.